Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. It's particularly delightful for me to introduce our current speaker. Catherine Kraft came to us almost a year ago now as our adjunct assistant curator, and it has been an absolute delight having her on the staff. I have to say that if you've seen the exhibition that we've installed recently upstairs, Rediscoveries, Modes of Making in Modern Sculpture, then you can get at least a sense of how much fun it is to work with Catherine. We had a wonderful time conceiving of that exhibition together and installing it together, and I think that hopefully you will agree that the results of that combination are pretty wonderful. Catherine actually is a native of Fort Worth, and she got her BA in art history at the Texas Christian University, got her master's degree in art history at University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and came back to Texas for her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, where she worked with the distinguished art historian Richard Schiff. In the meantime, actually, in between her master's degree at UVA and her PhD at UT, she worked for a few years in the Department of 20th Century Art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where she first met our director, Jeremy Strick. And it was there where she contributed as a research assistant to exhibitions and contributed to catalogs on Ellsworth Kelly and Robert Rauschenberg. After receiving her PhD, she worked in a number of capacities, both academic and museological, as well as in galleries in Texas and also abroad, with a number of years in Belgium and Germany as an independent art historian and an art consultant for Norwood Fine Arts in Munich. And it was there where she worked on a variety of topics, I would say, moving a little bit farther away from the core of her academic study and dealing with African and Japanese art as well. She has published quite extensively, and I will not go through the entire list of publications. I will say that one of the things she did while she was an independent art historian was she researched and thought and wrote a lot. There is a recent publication on Jasper Johns. It was published by Parkstone Press International in 2009, a really major monograph on the work of that artist. And then there are numerous contributions to academic journals, art magazines, and the like, as well as a variety of lectures at professional conferences and in relation to university symposia as well. Today, she is going to be speaking about her most recent publication, a wonderful new book on Neo-Dada in New York called An Audience of Artists, Dada, Neo-Dada, and the Emergence of Abstract Expressionism, 1945 to 1953. I will say that since joining the Nasher Sculpture Center, she has that book has been published. She has also published a number of important articles, including Cut, Tear, Scrape, Erase, Notes on Paper in 20th Century Drawing, which was just released in the journal Master Drawings. The article In Need of Repair, an unpublished statement by Robert Rauschenberg on his first combines, a really wonderful find and something that had never been published in terms of Rauschenberg's writings before, which appeared in the Burlington magazine just this past April. And then the article Lost and Found, an unpublished text on Marcel Duchamp by Robert Rauschenberg in Art in America. And, she's not done there. Coming up, she has a session at the College Art Association annual conference on the photographic record, images of and as objects, and as well as she is participating in a major conference in conjunction with the exhibition Dancing Around the Bridge, Cage, Cunningham, Johns, Rauschenberg, and Duchamp at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She's also got a monograph on Robert Rauschenberg coming out very soon, and is working on a follow-up publication to an audience of artists, Dada, Neo-Dada, and the emergence of abstract expressionism, on which she will be speaking about today. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Catherine Kraft.
Thank you, Jed. I was wondering this morning why I felt really tired, and now I think I know why. But it's so much fun. I can't seem to stop. I've worked on this book for a very long time, and I worked on it long enough that it got really big and became 2 books, and the second book is the one that I'm allegedly working on now, but I'm not really, because it took so long to get this one published that now I'm totally relaxed about when the other one may be done. And I'm too busy having fun doing things with actual artworks here at the Nasher. What I'd like to do today is deliver a prepared lecture that is sort of an excerpt of a book, the book condensed in a way that I hope makes some of its themes clear. It's a complicated book in that it looks at 2 or 3 different periods in time, and it follows artists over time as they have a chance to reflect upon their work and other artists' work and sort of change their mind about things as they get more of a perspective through the process of their own work. Jed mentioned my work at early on at the National Gallery, where I did work on exhibitions involving Ellsworth Kelly and Robert Rauschenberg. And I think the experience of working with living artists really soaked into this book, because I had been accustomed to thinking of artworks, the experience of art, as being artists and viewers. An artist makes a work of art, and then the viewer looks at it and writes a review or writes history or what have you. And what I found is that artists are, of course, also deeply involved in how history ends up being written, in terms of what they write and what they say about works, how they draw attention to works by other artists. And I got really interested in how history gets written in this sort of matrix of art being made and being looked at. And so I tried to find a way to write about this that would make these intertwined and interpenetrating processes as clear as possible. Dense, maybe, but hopefully very clear. In the fall of 1962, the New Realists exhibition opened in New York at the Sidney Janis Gallery. New Realists was the first major group show devoted to pop art and included Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, Klaus Oldenburg, and other American and European artists. Their apparent celebration of consumption, mass culture, and the commercial techniques used to promote them prompted deeply hostile responses to the show, not least because of the venue where it was shown, one of New York's most prestigious galleries. Founded in 1948, the Sidney Janis Gallery initially concentrated on such key figures of European modernism as Piet Mondrian and Fernand Léger. In the mid-1950s, Janis began to represent, in addition, many of the artists associated with abstract expressionism. By 1962, he was known primarily as the foremost dealer for these, the first American artists, said to be able to hold their own against the Europeans. The New Realist show was thus viewed as a decided departure, and it was further seen as Janis's bid to position his gallery vis-a-vis the latest and, for many, the most deplorable developments in contemporary art. In response, almost all of Sidney Janis's abstract expressionist artists left his gallery and sought representation elsewhere. The abstract expressionists weren't the only members of the art world who viewed Janis's show with consternation. Pop art was also considered the latest manifestation of something called Neo-Dada, a term used since the late 1950s, often as an insult, to characterize young artists whose work appeared sharply at odds with the serious, painterly, and expressive concerns of abstract expressionism. First applied to Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, Neo-Dada came to encompass a diverse range of art, including, in addition to pop, the environments and happenings of Alan Capro, the assembled constructions of Richard Stankiewicz and John Chamberlain, and the black paintings of Frank Stella, to name just a few. In fact, between 1957 and 1963, this word, Neo-Dada, was the first name applied to many of the most challenging developments in contemporary art, including assemblage, minimalism, fluxus, and contemporary art, and conceptual art, excuse me. So, as its name implies, Neo-Dada suggests a specific relationship to the past, namely that artists so named were perpetrating a revival of Dada, the avant-garde movement founded in Zurich in 1916, that had arisen from its participants' rage at the butchery of World War I and from their desire to expose the complacency and moral bankruptcy that had fostered war on a scale unprecedented in modern Europe. From Zurich, Dada had spread to Paris, Berlin, New York, Cologne, and other locations before coming to an end by 1924. Those involved with Dada had embarked on a program of social and cultural critique, political engagement, and radical experimentation, encompassing negativity, irreverent humor, and the use of unconventional materials. Now, according to most accounts of this time, Dada's unsustainable anarchy had just burned itself out, giving ways to the more structured agenda of surrealism, a movement founded in Paris in 1924. Neo-Dada's emergence thus came as an utter surprise to the movement's surviving participants, and not an altogether positive one. During the run of the New Realist show, two figures associated with Dada, Hans Richter and Marcel Duchamp, had a conversation about the problematic relationship between Dada and Neo-Dada. Richter was soon to publish an eyewitness account of the Dada movement, and the following remark from Duchamp would become central to the critique of Neo-Dada that concluded Richter's book. And here's Duchamp. This Neo-Dada, which they call New Realism, pop art, assemblage, etc., is an easy way out and lives on what Dada did. When I discovered ready-mades, I thought to discourage aesthetics. In Neo-Dada, they've taken my ready-mades and found aesthetic beauty in them. I threw the bottle rack and urinal into their faces as a challenge, and now they admire them for their aesthetic beauty. Duchamp's scathing remarks carried particular weight because more than any other artist, he was identified with the revival of interest in Dada that emerged in the late 1950s. Duchamp's ready-mades, everyday objects rendered works of art through an act of choice on the part of the artist, would provide the foundation for a decade's worth of explorations devoted to the nature of art and its relation to the world. In fact, the phenomenon of Neo-Dada inaugurated the 1960s deep fascination with Duchamp, a period of astonishing influence as younger artists turned to his cerebral, conceptually based approach to art as an alternative to abstract expressionism. Duchamp actually liked much of what he saw in contemporary art of this period. He really liked the work of Rauschenberg and Johns, also Capro and Warhol. But he was disturbed by the use that other artists were making of the past, which was, after all, his past. It was also a past whose history he had played a substantial role in shaping. Ironically, in fact, the New Realist show was the culmination of a process set in motion more than a decade earlier by two of the exhibition's most prominent critics, Duchamp himself and Robert Motherwell, one of the abstract expressionist artists who defected from the Sidney Janis Gallery after the New Realists exhibition. Duchamp and Motherwell were responsible for 2 points of reference then taken for granted as deserving the credit or blame for the art world's renewed interest in Dada. One was a book, the 1951 anthology, The Dada Painters and Poets, compiled and edited by Motherwell, whose dust jacket you see on the left. The other was an exhibition devoted to Dada and organized by Duchamp, held in 1953 at the Sidney Janis Gallery. Both were groundbreaking achievements, although they've never received much study or attention. Motherwell's book was actually the first anthology in English devoted to Dada, and even today has few rivals in any language, as a collection of primary documents on the movement. Similarly, Duchamp's was the first retrospective exhibition devoted solely to the movement. The two projects share, though, another characteristic, one that got me really interested. They can be viewed as points of origin for a renewed interest in Dada in the 1950s, but they're also the results of a process that began earlier in the 1940s, in the midst of World War II in New York. There, as a community of European émigré artists gathered for safety, Dada began to get a history that it hadn't had before, as former participants talked among themselves and with a younger generation about the actions that the First World War had prompted them to take. And among Dada artists in New York, or formerly Dada artists in New York at that time, we see Max Ernst, who was by then associated with Surrealism but had participated in Dada in Cologne. Here is André Breton, the founder of Surrealism, but he was also involved with Dada before. And over here we have Duchamp in profile, just after his arrival to New York from Paris. There, in New York, during the war, as a community of émigrés gathered for safety, Dada began to get a history that it hadn't had before, as these former participants talked among themselves. And the history of Dada generated during this period, one that would yield the phenomenon of Neo-Dada some years later, occurred in large part as the result of actions by artists. They were acting as writers and editors, as curators, critics, and historians, and as viewers of one another's work, but always in the end as artists. And it's their concerns as artists, at times converging, at others sharply clashing, that were to permeate the formation of Dada's historical identity and make possible the emergence of Neo-Dada. This collection or community of artists was in a way what inspired the title of the book. Artists looking at art by other artists, past and present, and at their own work as well, and responding to it through art, but also through criticism and through curatorial and historical means as well. Of course, artists look at art constantly, thankfully, but few have done so with the intensity and self-consciousness of artists in New York during and just after World War II. There was a very real anxiety among them about how and even whether art could be made in the wake of a really destructive world war. And one of the reasons for this interest in Dada was that artists at that time had also been facing exactly the same problem. How do you make art with so much calamity and catastrophe in the world? Artists frequently expressed the sentiment during this period that fellow artists were the only ones who really cared about what they were doing, that they were each other's artists, that they were each other's primary viewers. And the cover of my book has this in a sort of happy coincidence. This postcard is fairly well known among people who, I guess, are interested in this kind of thing. Obsessed Duchamp scholars. It's a postcard showing Marcel Duchamp with the artist Frances Picabia and their friend Beatrice Wood, who was at that time an amateur artist herself, but would later become a ceramicist. They're at Coney Island. This is 1917. And they're at a sort of photographer's studio where you would have, a sort of backdrop, and in this case, an ox cart, with a fake stuffed ox. And you would pose and have your photo taken. I found quite by chance in Barnett Newman's archives this photograph here, which is a photo of Barnett Newman and his wife Anna Lee with Robert Motherwell at Palisades Park in 1949, in exactly the same kind of studio setting, the painted backdrop and the ox cart replaced by a fancy car whose type I haven't quite sorted out yet. So what I'd like to do right now is go back to this publication and this exhibition and use them to look at what happens when artists, Duchamp and Motherwell in this case, handle history and how the processes of making history and making art can inform and shape each other. And I'd like to do so by way of those two objects that Duchamp mentioned in his annoyed remarks on Neo-Dada, the urinal and the bottle rack. Many of you are already familiar with the urinal, thanks especially to Fountainhead, our artist's book, just outside the doors here. The urinal is Fountain, perhaps Duchamp's most famous or infamous ready-made. He had sent it under a pseudonym as a submission to the 1917 Independent Society of Artists exhibition, whose organizers had guaranteed that any artist who paid their fee would be allowed to exhibit. Their rejection of Fountain prompted Duchamp to write a defense that became the raison d'etre of his ready-mades. Whether Mr. Mutt, with his own hands, made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under a new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object. The bottle rack is maybe less familiar. Duchamp acquired this object for his Paris studio in 1914, and it was at this time a fairly common, if becoming slightly old-fashioned, household object. It was used to dry wine bottles. You'd tip them up and put them on the spikes, and you could the rack would hold a lot of wine bottles, which I guess says something about the French love of wine. When Duchamp left for New York in 1915, his sister threw out the bottle rack when she cleaned out his studio because she didn't think there was anything special about it. It was a bottle rack. He didn't yet have a name for such objects. Only in New York would he discover the English word ready-made and begin to fully explore the possibilities of a type of art object that did not need to be physically made by an artist. Thus, the bottle rack is a transitional object, a not quite ready-made, lacking its name and the accompanying categorical concept. Fountain was at least photographed before its disappearance, but bottle rack left little trace. And in the 1930s, when a gallery in Paris wanted to have an exhibition on l'objet, the mysterious objects that had begun to fascinate the surrealists, they asked Duchamp, and he was of course happy to oblige, to go out and purchase another bottle rack, which you see here in the case for this show. And it was accompanied by various other sort of so-called primitive art objects, African and Oceanic. There are also surrealist objects. This over here is Salvador Dali's aphrodisiac jacket, which is a dinner jacket with shot glasses attached to it. So fitting in right there. Not what Duchamp maybe intended or was thinking about when he first purchased that bottle rack back in 1914. But times change. And this is just to give you an idea, a better view of some of the surrealist objects that were kind of included in this exhibition. And one of the sort of forerunners or inspirations for these type of surrealist objects were said to be Duchamp's ready-mades. And basically what happened was the object was included in the show, but Duchamp and Man Ray also made a photograph of it to provide an image for a magazine that was publishing essentially the exhibition catalog for the show. And now that it was a surrealist object, the bottle rack sympathetically transfigured itself. Man Ray's photograph heightens its mysteriously anthropomorphic character, and Duchamp's subtle subsequent manipulations, which I'll tell you about in a second, would further emphasize this quality. The bottle rack fills the composition of the photograph, coming close to its edges, and despite a cast shadow, the surrounding darkness of the background eliminates any substantial sense of spatial context. The rack's structural bands align to create a strong central vertical axis, and the slightly elevated viewpoint emphasizes the sort of bodily roundness of its torso-like shape. The photograph of the bottle rack is a meditation on the nature of objects, but it's also a meditation on past time, albeit a subversive one. If you look at the photograph of the bottle rack in the case, you'll see right here reflections. This was a brand new object, and it was probably like a galvanized iron with a sort of zinc plating, reflective, in other words. But the enigmatic expressiveness of the photograph of bottle rack has been heightened by an almost painterly mottling of the surface. Man Ray and Duchamp deliberately doctored the photograph so that the bottle rack they purchased, despite its shiny new appearance, appears in the photo to have gained a patina. In the intervening time since its first inception by Duchamp, some 22 years earlier. Taking time into their own hands, they mimicked the corrosive processes associated with its passage to generate a work that would itself be the eventual victim of these same forces. Their trickery yielded a backhanded celebration of the bottle rack's conceptual durability, but also qualified it. Its manufactured patina suggests another way that objects age, by the slow accumulation, layer upon layer, of ideas, associations, and interpretations generated by a succession of viewers over days, weeks, months, even years. There we go. Duchamp returned to New York in 1942, fleeing a Second World War, and if he was associated with any movement, it was Surrealism. Duchamp never joined the movement, but he was friends with many of its artists, and he had created memorable installations for their exhibitions. But in New York in the 1940s, Duchamp began to talk about Dada. He had never done so much before. Although they're taken for granted today, Duchamp's actual connections to Dada were quite tenuous at the time the movement really existed. Most of the works by him that are now associated with Dada, such as the bottle rack and other early ready-mades, were conceived before the Dada movement even existed. Dada learned about Zurich Dada late in 1916 or early 1917 while he was still in New York. And he went back to France in 1919 to visit his family, but Dada had not really started in Paris by that point. It wasn't until 1921, on another visit there, that he came into direct contact with Dada proper, fully 5 years after the movement had been founded. Now, once he learned of Dada, he quickly recognized parallels to his own interest, especially Dada's irreverent humor, but he kept a careful distance from the movement, reluctant to relinquish his independence, especially as he saw Dada shape itself into a movement like any other, its members bickering over control and fighting with other factions in the art world. During his 1921 trip to Paris, after witnessing the most recent clash between the Dadaists and Futurists, he ruefully assured a friend in New York, "From afar, these things, these movements, take on a kind of appeal they don't have close up, I can assure you." But in the 1940s, with Dada barely remembered except as Surrealism's forerunner, Duchamp began to associate himself with Dada as he'd never done. In one of his most well-known statements made in 1945, he emphasized this identification, in turn shaping it to fit his own interests. Dada was an extreme protest against the physical side of painting. It was a metaphysical attitude, a sort of nihilism to which I am still very sympathetic. It was a way to get out of a state of mind, to avoid being influenced by one's immediate environment or by the past, to get away from cliches, to get free. What's striking about Duchamp's identification with Dada is that it was very much of the present moment. Far from being simply an historical identification, it was a contemporary one as well. And in fact, among the former participants that Motherwell started talking with while working on the Dadas and painters and poets, Duchamp was the only one who claimed still to be a Dada. It seems likely that Duchamp initially turned to Dada in the 1940s in order once more to get free. In New York's small community of émigrés, Surrealism pressed much closer than it had in Paris. Sympathetic with many of its concerns, but deeply uneasy with its group agenda, Duchamp participated in a number of surrealist activities, but also tried to distance himself from its intrigues and rivalries. Identifying himself as Dada, past and present, caught Duchamp up in no political games, group pressures, or professional compromises. Dada was a way to fit into the history of modern art without joining it, to belong without conforming. Duchamp's unprecedented embrace of Dada attracted virtually no attention. There was almost no one in New York who knew enough about his work and the Dada movement to realize that a shift was occurring. And in fact, a 1952 profile in Life magazine entitled Dada's Daddy signaled an association that would become almost seamless over the next 2 decades, with Duchamp and Dada becoming almost interchangeable terms in popular culture as well as contemporary criticism. Duchamp contributed to this process quite actively at first, but he wasn't alone. There were others interested in Dada, and even as Duchamp remade Dada to suit his needs in the 1940s, so too was Motherwell about to do the same. Author of some of the best writings on art of this period, he was also the editor of a series of books called The Documents of Modern Art, which published writings by such key modernist figures as Kandinsky and Mondrian. The idea for a book about Dada had its origins in Motherwell's interest in surrealism. As far as he could tell from his conversations with Duchamp and others, Dada had been surrealism's older brother. Initially, he planned to publish a single text, a chronicle of the movement written in the 1930s by a literary critic. But he soon decided an anthology of primary material would be more interesting. In the months that followed, as word of his project spread, Dada's old war horses, as Motherwell called them, would charge into his publisher's bookstore to contribute texts and images, information, and advice. Eventually, the anthology would contain more than 24 pieces by a score of different writers, accompanied by illustrations of Dada periodicals and publications. Its international character was a considerable achievement, and for this we have Motherwell to thank. His willingness to challenge his preconceptions about Dada as he worked on the anthology resulted not only in a broadly international historical presentation of the subject not seen previously. Instead of merely the ashes from which surrealism rose, Dada would also emerge from Motherwell's anthology as a vital and important avant-garde movement in its own right. Motherwell credited his editorial achievement to the fact that he was personally distant from Dada's concerns. As he put it, having no axe to grind, he could afford to be detached and scholarly. But this was, however, not quite the case. It took 6 years for the book to reach publication, years that coincided with the development and emergence of abstract expressionism, and also with Motherwell's own growth into artistic maturity. Subtly but unmistakably, the anthology would become enmeshed with his own concerns as an artist and the art he saw developing around him. Now, fortunately for us, Motherwell and his publisher kept extensive records, and because it took so long for the book to be published, drafts and letters permit us to see how Motherwell changed his opinion about the project, about Dada, as time passed. And don't worry, I'm not going to get into specifics about this today. That's what the book is for. But I do want to bring your attention to one detail. Motherwell was fascinated with Dada, but he was really disturbed by what he called its monstrous destructiveness and what was widely considered its anti-art attitude. One of his strategies was to rehabilitate the Dadaist experiments and sort of radical anti-art destructive approaches through formal assessments of their work. According to Motherwell, to reach the end of the 1940s and look back at Dada with more than 30 years of hindsight was to see an extraordinary transformation. The temporal distance generated by the passing years had yielded a clearer image of Dada regardless of the original intention of its participants. Ephemeral, often headed for destruction, disintegration, or neglect, the Dada objects that did survive had come under the sway of the very forces they had initially been created to critique. By the 1940s, most of them dwelled in galleries and museums. As Motherwell put it, a generation later, the works of Dada appear more at home alongside abstract works than they do beside surrealist ones. Aligning Dada with abstraction by recognizing a formal resemblance suggestive of shared processes, let Motherwell diffuse Dada's destructiveness. And even Duchamp, who claimed, after all, still to be Dada, was, in Motherwell's view, no match for the passage of time. Despite Duchamp's later criticism of young Neo-Dada artists, they weren't the ones who had praised the bottle rack for its aesthetic beauty. It was Motherwell. As part of his recuperative approach to Dada, Motherwell singled out Duchamp's bottle rack in his introduction. Duchamp's bottle rack, a mass-produced utilitarian object, was his first ready-made, that is, a manufactured commercial object from everyday life that he selected and exhibited under his own name, conferring on it the status of sculpture, an anti-art and consequently Dada gesture. It is evident 35 years later that the bottle rack he chose has a more beautiful form than almost anything made in 1914 as sculpture. That's quite a statement. And what's interesting is it persists from one draft to the next. It's something that Motherwell came up with early on and didn't want to let go of. And just to let this sink in, as a sculpture from 1914, the bottle rack meets or surpasses the work of artists like Rodin, Boccioni, Picasso, even Duchamp's brother, Raymond Duchamp-Villon. Motherwell diffused Duchamp's outdated anti-art gesture by means of his own aesthetic response in the present. His description of bottle rack presents Duchamp as an artist in spite of himself, making beautiful and expressive sculpture even when attempting the opposite. But Motherwell's praise of the bottle rack as a beautiful and expressive sculpture also glides quietly over the fact that by the late 1940s, Duchamp's bottle rack did not, so to speak, exist. Motherwell had never seen it. The bottle rack that was purchased for the show in Paris in the 1930s disappeared shortly after it closed. It was probably used as a bottle rack and then tossed out. All that was left was this photograph, which is also included in the Dada Painters and Poets. Now, as an artist coming of age in the mid-20th century, Motherwell was accustomed to the mechanical reproduction of works of art, but his emphatic response to a picture, his emphatic reference to a picture of a non-existent object, reshapes the implications of his response, utterly undermining the assumption that the passage of time yields clarity. Motherwell was looking neither at a sculpture nor at an historically Dada moment, but at a picture of Duchamp's own later reimagining of it. That Motherwell responded to a sculpture, not to a sculpture, but to a picture, is not surprising. A few years earlier, he had made a drawing inspired by the 1938 Picasso drawing, Woman in an Armchair, followed by a group of collages inspired by the same drawing. However, in addition to Picasso, there are also decided echoes of Duchamp's surrealistically anthropomorphic bottle rack. The centralized human form of figure is a vertical core, tapering as it ascends from triangular skirt to slender spine, and from this core branches outward upraised linear elements suggestive of limbs. A similar treatment of limbs is accompanied in collage number 2 by dappled pieces of paper, recalling the mottled surface of bottle rack. Thus, in describing bottle rack as beautiful and expressive, Motherwell may well have been recalling his own response as an artist to its image. Duchamp, meanwhile, witnessed the ascent of what he called the retinal painting of Motherwell and his peers, with its stress on feeling over intellect with disbelief and distaste. Publicly, he maintained his polite reserve, at least until alternatives emerged in the late 50s. Privately, he redoubled efforts to claim Dada as an anti-painterly position of subversive resistance against what he described to a friend as a debacle in painting. But Duchamp's identification with Dada would begin to resonate in ways that even he could not have anticipated. And we're going to go without images. If you bear with me for just a couple of minutes, there's like historical stuff to get laid out. Follow me here. Duchamp's identification with Dada would start to take on things that he couldn't anticipate. The bulk of his activities, as I said, that could possibly be assigned to Dada had taken place in New York, but had occurred largely before he had ever heard of the Dada movement. It's thus possible to argue that if Duchamp were Dada, New York was Dada's birthplace as much as Zurich. And in fact, this begins to become a little bit of a theme in American publications of the 30s and 40s. For example, in the Museum of Modern Art's 1936 catalog for this big blockbuster show they did, Fantastic Art, Dada Surrealism, it was stated that Dada began in New York and Zurich about 1916. The idea of a New York Dada gained a wider appeal in the 1940s for reasons that are clear from Motherwell's statement on the dust jacket for the Dada painters and poets. Dada is the only movement in modern painting that took place simultaneously in the United States and Europe. The world Dada was a violent response bears great resemblances to our own. New York Dada provided Americans with a direct link to the purest and most radical aspects of the European avant-garde, a vital precedent for the emergence of abstract expressionism. Duchamp would run head-on into this unexpectedly intensified interest in New York Dada when he proposed doing a show on Dada to Sidney Janis in 1952. Now, he had known Sidney Janis and his wife Harriet for a number of years. In 1945, the couple published a laudatory essay on Duchamp, and when Sidney Janis opened his gallery in 1948, Duchamp was a contributor to its program, and for an early exhibition, he even authorized Janis to create a replica of Fountain by going out and buying a new urinal that Duchamp then signed. For the Dada show, Duchamp would select the works, design the catalog, translate its essays into English, install the show, and talk with the press. A public relations dream. Later accounts of the exhibition have tended to emphasize the free hand Duchamp had in its organization. But Sidney Janis was no passive bystander. In his view, the plan of the show was to focus on Duchamp. Focusing on Duchamp meant, by extension, focusing on New York. Not only would the Sidney Janis Gallery's Dada exhibition include a section on New York Dada, it would occupy a central position in the main gallery, on axis with the doorway, so it would be one of the first things that a visitor saw. And that may give you, it's pretty grainy, but it may give you an idea. And these are all works by Duchamp, including some that he made in Paris, actually. And in fact, almost half of the New York Dada items listed in the catalog were in fact by Duchamp. The favoritism did not go unnoticed. According to Sidney Janis, two former participants from Zurich and Berlin Dada, one of whom was probably Hans Richter, who assisted with the Swiss and German portions of the show, attempted to rearrange the installation, moving some of Duchamp's works to make space in the main room for pieces they considered more characteristic of the movement. As Janis recalled with bemusement, Duchamp made no attempt to stop them. Marcel's attitude was to let them do it. He had no objection at all to being put in the back room. I wouldn't have it, and I finally had to lay down the law to the other two and tell them it was my show. Well, now, did Duchamp know I was going to do that? Or didn't he really care? We might say that Duchamp's concerns were elsewhere. And what those concerns were can be seen from the transcript of a lengthy interview he gave to the Janises during preparations for the show. This transcript is now in the possession of their son, who, to my relief and happiness, allowed me to publish excerpts from it in the book. And it's really fascinating because it's here that tension surfaced about the nature of Duchamp's connection to Dada, especially New York Dada. Underlying the Janises interview was a question that remains central to understanding Dada, really even today. Was Dada a movement or is Dada an attitude? Its status as a movement seems really clear. And yet Dada's own participants often insisted on characterizing Dada in terms of its spirit, as Duchamp routinely did. Moreover, the character of Dada itself changes substantially when considered as an attitude rather than a movement. Dada as attitude is Dada at its most hostile to the constructs of history. But it's also Dada at its most vulnerable, capable of being manipulated and applied to any number of situations and objects. Among Duchamp's many contributions to the Dada painters and poets, for example, was the suggested insertion of a pre-Dada section. That's where they ended up putting the image of the bottle rack, for instance. Now, this looks like a solid move in favor of historical context, but it's also a quiet, subversive thrust against history, as was his claim still to be a Dada. The Janises sum up the problem in one of my favorite quotes of all time. It's just incredible, and they said this in their 1945 article. Always an active Dadaist, Duchamp's attitudes were articulated, however, in the years preceding Dada. And although acclaimed by the Surrealists, he retains these proto-Dada attitudes in their nascent state. What does that mean? I don't know, and I don't think they did either. If Dada somehow existed before Dada as well as after Dada, did Dada exist at all? If Dada was everywhere, could it be only somewhere? So, as might be expected during their interview, the Janises tried to clarify this question of pre-Dada, proto-Dada, always already Dada. And central to this task was the status of the ready-mades, especially the early ones. And so in a myriad different ways in the interview, the Janises tried to fit what they knew about ready-mades together with what they knew about Dada, asking, for example, the dates of the earliest ready-mades, lining them up with the date of Dada's start in Zurich. Duchamp's confirmation that he had created ready-mades prior to Dada's founding in Switzerland prompted both Janises to suggest that Dada had perhaps originated not in Zurich but in New York, only to be met by Duchamp's adamant rejection of the idea. He argued instead that the founding of Dada was based on the discovery of the name and the idea to make a movement out of the name. As the Janises pressed the connection between Dada and the ready-mades, Duchamp began to resist. So all this is Dada, if you want to call everything Dada, but I don't care for Dada. Dada does not interest me. Why should I be called Dada 10 years later on by things I've done 10 years before? As Sidney Janis tried to make the case for New York Dada, Duchamp put his foot down. Sidney. Now, from 1913 to 1916, when Dada really began, there was an awful lot of Dada work that was done in New York City. Duchamp. Yes, but why call it Dada? I object. If Dada is Zurich, and leave it in Zurich, and all the work of Zurich is Dada, and the rest is not Dada. Sidney. The only point to be made here is that this attitude was very rampant at this time, whereas it was very sporadic at the other. Duchamp. Yes, but the word Dada doesn't correspond with the attitude, with the right name of the attitude. It happens to be Dada today because we have that word at our disposal. It's a period, it's a name for a period, and unfortunately journalized to the extent that it's silly to call the ready-mades Dada because I refuse. So there. As the discussion continued, Duchamp set forth something of an ultimatum. You have to decide whether Dada is an attitude or a movement. Once you've decided, if it is an attitude, then you have the attitude that was at the time of the Greeks, the times of the Romans, or the time of Tristan Tzara. It's an attitude. But if it's a movement, it starts in 16 with Zurich and ends in 23 with Surrealism. And then this doesn't come in at all, pre or no pre-Dada, because this doesn't matter even if it prepared the idea. The Janis' reluctance to choose between Duchamp's attitude or movement options, voiced in an extended debate, which I will spare you, indicates the unsatisfactory nature of the choice. Dada is both more and less than a movement or an attitude. Dada as movement gives us the opportunity of historical coherence, a group of objects, individuals and events, given purpose and meaning by their intimacy in the continuum of the past, while Dada as attitude allows for more imaginative and less restrictive connections to be made across time. By the conclusion of the interview, Duchamp had made delicate concessions, pointing the way. Looking at a reproduction of a work called Zank Czech, he pointed out its date. So that was regular Dada, see 1919, perfectly good Dada epic, huh? Similarly, Baguère d'Austerlitz was a continuation of Dada, naturally. It was made in 1921. In the end, Duchamp's Dada exhibition encompassed the years he proposed to the Janis as the lifespan of the movement, 1916 to 1923. And it included the ready-mades that fell into these years, but there was no bottle rack, no snow shovel, no ready-made, or any other work made prior to 1916. Among the show's more than 200 items. Still, echoes of the issues raised in their conversation lingered. Duchamp would cheerfully declare to journalists who visited the exhibition, Dada is not passé, the Dada spirit is eternal. As a compromise, New York and Zurich shared the main room, but New York nonetheless remained at the galleries and the exhibition's center. Duchamp found other ways of responding to the complicated question of Dada's origins, and in fact, subtle interventions tampered with the city model of Dada that favored New York. Several works by Duchamp included in the New York Dada section had actually been made in Paris, and in a small back room, this very large painting, Tum, which is looming over the sign for Paris, was actually made for a collector's apartment on Central Park West in New York. As for the design of the exhibition, and it's really tricky to tell with photographs, what Duchamp did was to suspend plexiglass panels from the ceiling, and you can see the little strings for some of them, and he also put plexiglass panels in the ceiling, and then he sandwiched works in between the plexiglass hanging down. So even though you have this sign that says Zurich, and these are works that were made in Zurich, the works that are suspended in plexiglass were actually made in Cologne. And what would have happened is that this resulting effect of transparency really disrupts the geographical distinctions that are promised by these very bland, neutral signs bearing the names of cities. The overlapping and interpenetrating visual impressions would generate momentary collages for visitors, not only of texts and images, but also of the various cities. In Duchamp's presentation of Dada, such categories appeared provisional at best, ready to shift or merge with nothing more needed than a visitor's movement through the exhibition. Duchamp had managed to keep Dada from laying claim to his first ready-mades, but his victory was short-lived. He'd be less and less able to control such associations in the years to come. By the 1960s, Duchamp and Dada, with the ready-mades marking the site of their conjunction, would be virtually synonymous. Apart from an occasional aside to a friend, like Duchamp's annoyed remark to Richter, he would rarely bother to protest. The results are with us still. I presented portions of this particular aspect of research at a symposium at MoMA during the last really big Dada show, and I prepared it without having seen their installation, and then I walked into it, and that was the entrance to their show. And to their credit, they arranged the installation so the rooms kind of joined up in a circle, but you had to start there. And there's the sign that says New York right there on the wall. Looking back at the Janis Dada show, one wonders whether Duchamp had started to see it coming. The consequences of his newly emphatic association with Dada and how he wouldn't be able to control it, not completely. I've come to think that a hint may be provided by the installation of the replica of Fountain, the object whose initial deliberate aim at hypocrisy and double standards brought it perhaps closest of all Duchamp's New York ready-mades to the provocations of Dada. Duchamp placed it. Here you see it. Duchamp placed it festooned with a sprig of mistletoe. Above the doorway, that was the entrance to the exhibition's main gallery. Standing on its threshold, gazing at New York Dada and ready for a kiss, the visitor, Janis, even Duchamp himself, could expect only a slapstick dousing from above. Thanks very much. There is more where this came from, obviously, but I'll spare you. Thanks very, very much.